Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in West Virginia history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. What locations and times of day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. The town of Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, 1896, is located in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. Its violent past goes back to John Brown's well-known raid, a period when the Civil War was still fresh in the local memories and the sound of steam engines reverberated throughout the valley. Here, in a white clapboard house with a view of the river confluence, the Blackwood sisters ran what the locals referred to as the finest boarding house in the county. Their reputation for hospitality was equaled only by the enigmatic disappearances that beset the establishment. Disappearances that would not be linked until decades later. According to county records, at least 7 travelers who stayed at the Blackwood House between 1892 and 1896 vanished from sight. But sometimes their possessions would reappear, a pair of spectacles here, a pocket watch there, always in the hands of one of the 3 sisters who owned the business. In response to questions, they described visitors leaving early, frequently before sunrise, and leaving personal belongings behind as payment for unpaid bills. Thomas Harlow, the local sheriff and the sisters' married cousin, never followed up on these issues. Until 1953, when Georgetown University professor James Whitaker discovered a set of ledgers while researching his book on post-Civil War business in the Shenandoah Valley. The Blackwood sisters' story was hidden away in judicial archives. After his own unexplained disappearance in 1968, what he discovered set him on a course that would eventually be sealed by official decree. What follows is an account assembled from newspaper clippings, surviving records, and conversations with descendants of Harper's Ferry residents throughout those 4 tragic years. A delicious lunch was frequently the prelude to something far more sinister, and the records paint a picture of loneliness, desperation, and the darkest manifestations of human need, a world where hospitality concealed deliberate evil. Beginning in the early 19th century, the Blackwood family had a long history in Jefferson County. According to 1823 land deed documents, Baltimore merchant Jeremiah Blackwood bought 20 acres with a view of the rivers, including the land on which the house would eventually be built. Jeremiah's business ledgers, which are partially preserved in the Jefferson County Historical Society collection, show that he established a successful dry goods business on Shenandoah Street, importing fine fabrics and household items from eastern cities. The deed, which is preserved in county archives, describes the property as a superior parcel with commanding views of the river junction and access to the main thoroughfare. According to St. Peter's Catholic Church's local church archives, the Blackwoods were well-known members of the congregation and made a significant contribution to the building of a new church structure in 1833. The minutes of ladies' auxiliary meetings often identified Jeremiah's wife, Catherine, as the person who hosts social events for high-profile families and organizes charity drives for the underprivileged. The Blackwoods had grown their assets to include a small farm outside of town and multiple rental homes along High Street by 1840, according to tax assessment records, in addition to their original property and shop. In 1842, a Baltimore business directory described Jeremiah Blackwood as one of the foremost merchants of the growing river community, whose establishment provides superior goods to the distinguished families of Jefferson County. William, their 1821-born son, was moved east for his education, first attending a Philadelphia preparatory academy, and then Harvard College, where he graduated in 1842, according to alumni records. As his father grew older, William moved back to Harper's Ferry and ultimately assumed control of the family companies. Following Jeremiah's death in 1852, William inherited all of the family's assets, which at that time constituted one of Jefferson County's largest private fortunes. In 1853, William married Elizabeth Hollister, bringing together two powerful local families. A brief ad in the Virginia Free Press said that the most distinguished personages of the region, including members of the well-known Washburn, Stower, and Lockwood families, attended the wedding. As a lady of refined education and considerable personal fortune, Elizabeth had gone to New York's prestigious Troy Female Seminary. The couple took up residence in the family mansion with a view of the rivers, which William had completely refurbished after his father's passing. Significant additions, such as the erection of a third floor, enlarged kitchen facilities, and updated plumbing, unusual luxuries for the time, are documented in building permits submitted to the county. By all accounts, the Blackwoods were leading the life that was expected of the local gentry, having dinner parties, going to church, and engaging in the seasonal social customs of affluent families. Eleanor was born in 1858, Ruth in 1863, and Margaret, their first daughter, was born in 1854. According to St. Peter's baptism records, each infant was christened with a great deal of pomp, and the godparents were chosen from among the most well-known families in the area. The girls' early education was provided by private tutors imported from Baltimore and Philadelphia, according to school records, which is another indication of the family's wealth and status. Like so many families in the border states, the Blackwoods' lives were completely altered by the Civil War. When Virginia decided to separate from the Union in April 1861, William Blackwood, who had inherited the family's assets from his father in 1852, made a crucial choice. There was a great deal of division in Jefferson County, which would eventually become a portion of West Virginia. William, who attended northern schools and had substantial business holdings in Philadelphia and Baltimore, decided to back the Union. In July 1861, William Blackwood was commissioned as lieutenant colonel in the 2nd West Virginia Volunteer Infantry, according to military documents. He served with distinction, having been wounded in the Battle of Cedar Creek in October 1864, and taking part in General Sheridan's offensive in the Shenandoah Valley. William's internal conflict is shown in letters to Elizabeth that were saved in a private collection and given to the West Virginia State Archives in 1947. The letters also show that the Blackwood businesses suffered greatly while William was away. I cannot in good conscience support the dissolution of our great republic, though I know my position places you and our dear children in a difficult position among our neighbors. I pray that when this conflict ends, reconciliation will be possible. By 1864, things had gotten worse. He writes in a letter dated June 1863, "Your report of the store's declining trade pains me, though I understand that many who once counted themselves our friends now take their custom elsewhere. We must endure this trial, as we have others, with dignity and patience." A letter from September states, "I am distressed to hear that the rental properties now stand empty, and that you have been forced to dismiss the household staff. Please assure Martha and Joseph that they will be welcome back when circumstances improve." Throughout the war, Harper's Ferry was occupied by both Union and Confederate forces, and it changed hands several times. At different times, the Blackwood residence was commandeered as an officer's quarters because of its prominent location with a view of the rivers. In 1866, a damage claim was submitted to the federal government, detailing the considerable damage to the property, which included both armies' troops stealing household objects, breaking windows, defacing walls, and destroying furniture. However, he did not come home with the win he had hoped for. Confederate sentiment had been very prevalent in the area, and people who had backed the Union were frequently viewed as traitors. In the community they had once helped create, the Blackwood family now found themselves social outcasts. Colonel Blackwood attended services today for the first time since his return, wrote Reverend Samuel Woodson, the pastor of the Presbyterian church the Blackwoods had attended for generations, in his personal journal in September 1865. Several families rose and departed when he entered. His wife looked distressed, but the colonel himself maintained his dignity. The three daughters sat very still, like little statues. One wonders what effect this treatment will have on such young minds. For years, they were shunned. According to historical business ledgers, local merchants frequently refused to provide the Blackwoods credit that was regularly extended to other families of comparable status, or charged them greater costs. Social gathering invitations ceased to come in. The formerly well-known family withdrew into ever greater seclusion. The Blackwoods' declining social standing is revealed in a diary kept by Harriet Stanton, a neighbor whose family maintained friendly relations with them. Took tea with Elizabeth yesterday. The house, once so full of life and visitors, stands silent now. The girls are growing up without proper society or friends their own age. Elizabeth confided that they have received no invitations to any of the summer gatherings. The colonel spends his days in his study with his books and his bourbon. One feels the weight of their isolation upon crossing the threshold. The colonel's wife, Elizabeth Blackwood, seems to have been the one who was most negatively impacted by this seclusion. There are several entries about her health in Dr. Theodore Lambert's 1872 medical journal. Lambert's journal gives a progressive account of Elizabeth's declining mental health. Mrs. B continues to exhibit symptoms of nervous exhaustion and melancholia. She speaks of hearing whispers when in town and believes former friends are conspiring against the family. The colonel reports she has taken to spending entire days in her bedroom with the curtains drawn. April 1873. Mrs. B now refuses to leave the house entirely, has developed peculiar habits, insists on checking the locks multiple times each night, believes neighbors are observing the house from the woods beyond the garden, has lost considerable weight due to poor appetite. November 1874. Mrs. B's condition continues to worsen. Now exhibits paranoid delusions regarding the household food. Believes unnamed enemies are attempting to poison the family. Has taken to preparing all meals herself, despite the fact that this was previously the domain of household staff. The colonel reports she will not allow the daughters to eat anything she has not personally prepared and tasted first. February 1875. Most troubling development in Mrs. B's case. She now experiences auditory hallucinations, voices instructing her to protect her daughters from unnamed threats. Has taken to sleeping outside their bedroom door. Personal hygiene severely neglected. Have suggested institutional care, but the colonel refuses to consider it at present. Elizabeth's health had gotten so bad by 1876 that home care was no longer an option. She was admitted on June 12, 1876, according to records from Western State Hospital in Staunton, Virginia, with a diagnosis of severe melancholia with paranoid features. The admitting physician wrote, "Patient believes her food is being poisoned by neighbors. Shows extreme agitation when served meals. Has lost considerable weight due to refusal to eat." Elizabeth's condition did not improve over time, according to the hospital's quarterly reports to Colonel Blackwood, copies of which were kept in Dr. Lambert's files. September 1876. Patient remains withdrawn and suspicious. Accepts only minimal nourishment and must be closely monitored to ensure adequate intake. Refuses to participate in occupational therapy or social activities. December 1877. Patient has developed ritual behaviors around food consumption. Will only eat after elaborate preparation and inspection of all items. Has accused hospital staff of collusion with unnamed enemies. sedation occasionally required during episodes of extreme agitation. March 1879. No significant improvement. Patient now speaks rarely, even to attending physicians. Continues to express belief that she was committed to prevent her from protecting her daughters from harm. Requests to see her children have become less frequent. Until her passing in 1883, Elizabeth stayed in an institution. She was withdrawn and uncommunicative during her stay, according to hospital records, but caregivers observed that she brightened somewhat when her children visited sometimes. The death certificate lists the cause as general failure of health systems consequent to self-starvation, implying that Elizabeth's paranoia about food had ultimately contributed to her death. The colonel only made 2 visits in 7 years, stating that the demands of managing the family properties alone prevented more frequent travel. She was laid to rest in Harper's Ferry's Blackwood family plot, although according to burial records, few people showed up for the event, which is another sign of the family's ongoing social exclusion. During these challenging years, the 3 daughters, Margaret, Eleanor, and Ruth, were mainly left on their own. All 3 were outstanding students, according to Jefferson Academy School records, with Margaret being especially talented in accounting and mathematics. Her term papers, which have been preserved in the Academy's archives, demonstrate an uncommon emphasis on investment techniques and money management, subjects that young women of the era seldom studied. Eleanor's prize-winning embroidery from the 1872 Jefferson County Fair demonstrated her ability in domestic arts. Ruth's teachers noted her perfectionist tendencies, with one evaluation remarking that Miss Eleanor will unpick and restart her work multiple times until achieving the exact result she desires, showing unusual patience for one so young. The local newspaper described Ruth's work as showing exceptional precision and attention to detail, with stitches so fine as to be nearly invisible to the naked eye. Ruth's 13-year-old essay, which has been saved in the Academy's archives, reveals an odd fascination with food preparation and preservation, especially with regard to meats. According to the essay's title, On Modern Methods of Food Preservation and Their Chemical Foundations, the student's level of knowledge is far higher than what is typical for her age. Her science teacher made a comment, "Unusually detailed understanding of organic decomposition for a student of her age, somewhat concerning focus on methods of preserving animal tissue." After their mother was admitted to the hospital, all 3 girls, Margaret at age 18, Eleanor at age 14, and Ruth at age 9, withdrew from formal schooling. Given the family's ongoing social isolation, the colonel reportedly concluded that home education was preferable. He employed a number of instructors, but according to town records, none of them stayed more than a few months. The Blackwood girls are intelligent beyond their years, but there is something disquieting about the household. The youngest especially asks questions that no child should contemplate. The colonel is often absent, and the house maintains a silence that presses upon one's spirits. I shall not renew my contract when the term ends. Another tutor, James Harrison, lasted only 6 weeks before leaving without receiving his final wages. Miss Carolyn Spencer wrote these words to a friend in Baltimore in 1879. In a letter to the headmaster of his previous institution, he clarified, "The situation at the Blackwood house is not as represented." The girls, while intellectually capable, display disturbing tendencies. The eldest manages the household accounts with suspicious precision for one her age. The middle child spends hours arranging and rearranging items in the house to achieve some standard of order only she can discern. And the youngest, I cannot adequately describe my discomfort with her preoccupations. She dissects small animals found on the property, claiming scientific interest, but the enthusiasm she displays is most unseemly. The colonel, when present, is either indifferent or inebriated. I could not, in good conscience, continue. The Blackwood sisters lived in ever greater seclusion for the following 15 years. According to the neighbors, they were only seen at church or when they had to go into town for supplies. Only a few devoted friends and distant relatives who occasionally traveled from out of town remained in the family's previously wide social circle. In the late 1880s, Colonel Blackwood's health started to deteriorate. According to Dr. Lambert's logbook, he was treated for respiratory issues as well as periods of agitation and bewilderment, especially at night. The doctor's notes from 1890 express concern about the colonel's mental state. Patient expresses belief that former Confederate soldiers are plotting to burn his house, has taken to keeping loaded firearms in every room, have advised the daughters to secure these weapons as the colonel's hands shake considerably and he may pose a danger to himself or others. A particularly telling entry from November 1890 reads, "Called to the Blackwood house at midnight. The colonel had fired his revolver through the bedroom window, claiming he saw intruders in the garden. No evidence of any such presence. The daughters appeared remarkably calm throughout the incident. The eldest, Miss Margaret, explained that such episodes were becoming common and inquired about stronger sedatives than I had previously prescribed. Colonel Blackwood passed away in February 1891, and few people showed out for his funeral. The Jefferson County Advocate's obituary was succinct, mentioning only his military service. No cause of death was specified, though Dr. Lambert's private records indicate failure of the heart, possibly hastened by years of melancholia and excessive consumption of spirits. A more troubling note appears in Lambert's personal journal, never intended for public view. Am not entirely satisfied with the circumstances of the colonel's passing. Called to certify death in early morning hours. Body already prepared for burial by the daughters, unusual in itself. Miss Margaret cited the colonel's explicit wishes to avoid unnecessary handling. No obvious signs of violence or self-harm, though the daughters' composure was remarkable for those who had just lost their only remaining parent. When I suggested a more thorough examination might be appropriate, Miss Ruth commented that further invasion of father's dignity would serve no purpose, as what's done is done. The phrasing struck me as peculiar. Have signed the certificate as requested, though certain questions remain. Following the colonel's passing, his daughters found themselves in a difficult financial situation. According to military pension records, his Union Army pension ended when he passed away. As commercial endeavors failed, the colonel progressively sold off assets to maintain their lifestyle, which resulted in a reduction of the family's previously large holdings throughout the years. The house on the hill and a little savings were all that were left by 1891. According to bank documents from the Harper's Ferry National Bank that Professor Whitaker discovered in 1954, the Blackwood account had just $237.42 when the colonel passed away, which is not enough to sustain 3 single women for more than a few months under even the most basic of conditions. However, within a year, consistent deposits started to come in, eventually increasing to sizable amounts that enabled the sisters to not only keep up their home, but also make major modifications to the property. The idea to turn the family home into a boarding house came from Margaret, the oldest and most sensible of the sisters. Our location near the railway station and the quality of accommodations we can provide should attract a respectable clientele of travelers requiring temporary lodging. We anticipate primarily serving businessmen and tourists visiting the historical sites of Harper's Ferry, she writes in a March 7, 1892, letter to the Jefferson County Clerk asking for the proper business license. The Blackwood house was quickly and completely transformed. The interior was altered by local carpenter Joseph Winters, who improved the plumbing and added more beds from the once roomy family quarters to make accommodation for paying visitors. The unusual item on his invoice, which is still in the county records, is reinforcement of basement ceiling beams and installation of specialized drainage system, as per Miss Blackwood's specifications. The invoice was much more than the average cost of renovations at the time, indicating that the boarding house had undergone extensive modifications beyond what was required. Later, Winters made a remark to Timothy Hayes, his apprentice, regarding the peculiarity of the subterranean labor. Hayes, interviewed by Professor Whitaker in 1954, recalled, "Mr. Winters said it was the strangest job he'd ever done. Said Miss Margaret had very specific requirements. Wanted a drain in the floor that connected directly to the river. Wanted hooks in the ceiling beams that could support substantial weight. Wanted the walls lined with copper sheeting in one section. Said he didn't ask questions because the pay was good, but he never felt right about it." Hayes added a detail that caught Whitaker's attention. "Mr. Winters told me they brought in special equipment from Baltimore. A large cast-iron table with channels running to the edges and a drain in the center. Took 4 men to move it into the basement. Miss Margaret said it was for laundry purposes, but Mr. Winters said he'd never seen a laundry table made that way, with restraining brackets along the edges and that particular drainage setup. Said it reminded him more of equipment he'd seen in a slaughterhouse when he did renovation work for the Shepherd family's butcher shop in Charlestown." The Blackwood House was operational by May 1892. The Baltimore Sun ran an ad describing it as a superior establishment offering clean, comfortable rooms and home-cooked meals of exceptional quality, conveniently located within walking distance of the Harper's Ferry train station. Weekly and monthly rates available for extended stays. The sisters were apparently reaching out to a wide range of potential guests, as similar ads appeared in newspapers in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and Richmond. All of the ads emphasized the same things: first-rate lodging, excellent food, and the proprietress's individual attention. The Philadelphia Inquirer had a notice that said, "Particularly well-suited for gentlemen traveling on business who appreciate fine cuisine and attentive service in a home-like setting." The company seemed to take off right away. The sisters' revenue increased significantly during the first year of operation, according to tax data. Curiously, though, this financial success was achieved in spite of comparatively few guest register entries. Professor Whitaker's notes indicate that the average occupancy rate in the register was just 30%, which is much too low to explain the stated income. An entry in Margaret Blackwood's private ledger, found among the 1968 sealed files, may help to explain the disparity. A note from September 1892 states, "Have determined that official registration of all guests creates unnecessary documentation. Those selected for special hospitality will be recorded in this private ledger only. This arrangement should minimize complications should inquiries arise." Almost immediately, local merchants noticed the sisters' buying habits. The orders from the sisters were meticulously documented by Thomas Wilson's grandpa, who maintained the general store on High Street. His ledger reveals that he frequently bought odd things, such bulk lye, specialty knives, several sets of fine bone china that were frequently replaced, and unusually high quantities of some spices, especially those that are known to overpower other flavors. When he asked Miss Margaret about it once, she simply smiled and said they had special preservation needs for their kitchen. Wilson told Professor Whitaker about his grandfather's observations. "Granddad said the Blackwood sisters bought more preserving salt than any family he'd ever seen, even those who were putting up meat for the winter. And they bought it year-round, not just during butchering season." The Jenkins family's hardware store provided another piece of the puzzle. The sisters bought unusual amounts of locks, chains, and heavy-duty shackles. the kind usually used to secure cattle according to their sales records. In response to questions, they stated that these things were necessary for securing the basement storage room where they kept their valuable supplies and family heirlooms. About 9 months after the boarding house's opening, in February 1893, the first disappearance linked to the Blackwood house was reported. On February 14th, Baltimore timber dealer Howard Phillips arrived for a 3-night stay with the intention of negotiating the purchase rights to desirable forest in the neighboring Blue Ridge. He paid his bill in full and checked out on February 17th, according to the guest register. However, when Phillips did not return to Baltimore, his family filed a missing persons report. On February 20th, Sheriff Harlow received a telegraph requesting any information about Phillips's location. In response, Harlow said, "Mr. Phillips departed Harper's Ferry by morning train on February 17th, according to boarding house proprietors. No further information available." The response is still in the Baltimore Police Archives. Professor Whitaker's discovery of a notation in Margaret Blackwood's private ledger among the 1968 sealed files is what makes this case so intriguing. A more unsettling entry appears on February 18th. Ruth's special preparation most successful. Guests at dinner commented specifically on the tenderness of the roast. Eleanor's new preservation technique appears effective. No detectable odor or discoloration. We'll continue with this method for future special preparations. The entry for February 17th states, Mr. P. settled his account in full. The disappearance of Philadelphia land speculator Edward Cartwright in June 1893 revealed a similar trend. Cartwright was listed as having left on June 13th, but he had really arrived on June 10th. After he failed to come home and missed multiple crucial business appointments, his family filed a missing persons report on June 20th. During a quick visit to the Blackwood house as part of his investigation, Sheriff Harlow accepted his cousin's account that Mr. Cartwright had indicated plans to tour Shenandoah Valley Estates prior to his return to Philadelphia. Although Cartwright's horse and carriage remained unclaimed at the local livery stable for weeks, no further investigation was conducted. Margaret's entry in the ledger on June 13th states, Mr. C. account settled. Gold pocket watch of superior quality. Eleanor finds his walking stick useful for reaching high shelves. Ruth pleased with the quality of his boots, though too large for any of us. A subsequent entry from June 14th clarifies, Ruth experimenting with new marinade for special preparation. Results excellent. Diners commented that the meat was more flavorful than previous offerings. Must remember, subjects who consume alcohol regularly require additional soaking time to remove bitter undertones. Margaret's ledger would include identical entries for the next 3 years, all of which corresponded with guests who were ultimately reported missing. There was a recurring pattern. Businessmen without local contacts traveling alone and carrying cash. They would show up, spend 2 or 3 nights there, and then allegedly leave early in the morning when no one was around to see them. Protected by their family's long-standing, albeit complex status in the society and their reputation as respectable spinsters, the sisters' business went on without drawing attention. Widow Harrison, their neighbor to the east, later recalled, "Those girls were so quiet, so proper. Always nodded politely when passing on the street. Kept that house immaculate. You could see the windows shining from across the river. Never would have thought they had it in them, though there was something about Ruth's eyes that never seemed right to me, too calculating for a woman so young." Another neighbor, Franklin Myers, whose property adjoined the Blackwood house to the north, told Professor Whitaker, "Sometimes at night I'd hear noises coming from their place, not like a party or guests talking, more like furniture being moved, heavy things being dragged. And once or twice I could swear I heard a sort of mechanical sound, like a pulley or winch operating. Always late at night, well after decent folks were asleep. I mentioned it to Sheriff Harlow once, but he said the ladies probably just suffered from insomnia and were rearranging their furniture. Myers added a detail he had previously withheld. There was one night, must have been the summer of '95, when I was out late checking on my livestock during a thunderstorm. Saw lights in the Blackwood basement windows, which was unusual at that hour. Lightning flashed, and I caught a glimpse of something through the window that I've tried to forget ever since. Looked like the youngest sister, Ruth, working at some kind of table. She had her back to the window, but I could see she was wearing something like a butcher's apron, all stained dark. There was something on the table in front of her, something large. The lightning stopped, and I couldn't see clearly anymore. Told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes. Never mentioned it to anyone until now. Within their company, the Blackwood sisters upheld rigid duties. The oldest, Margaret, was in charge of guest registration and all financial affairs. Eleanor was in charge of the linens and housekeeping. The youngest, Ruth, also had total authority over the dining room and kitchen. This division of labor made it possible for each sister to rule her territory with little interference from the others. This structure would later be important when authorities tried to assign blame to specific individuals. In a 1955 interview, Sarah Jenkins, who had been a maid at the Blackwood house for a short time in 1894, offered a unique insight into the day-to-day activities. The elderly Jenkins recalled, Miss Margaret was always at the desk, watching who came and went. She had a way of sizing up the gentlemen as they arrived, looking at their clothes, their luggage, their hands. Some she would greet warmly, others more coolly. The ones she was particularly nice to were always the ones who left early and weren't seen again. Jenkins continued, Miss Eleanor was in charge of the rooms, very particular about the linens. They had to be perfectly white. Sometimes I'd find stains on sheets or towels and she'd take them from me immediately, saying she would handle them personally. Never let me near the washing when certain items needed cleaning. Jenkins also described the peculiar system Eleanor had developed for keeping track of linens. She had this book where she recorded every item, how many times it had been washed, when it had been purchased, when it needed to be replaced. If a sheet or tablecloth had been used for what she called special service, it was marked with a small red thread in the hem. Those items were always washed separately, and Miss Eleanor handled them herself. Jenkins' observations about Ruth Blackwood were particularly illuminating. Miss Ruth was strangest of all. Wouldn't allow anyone in her kitchen while she was preparing meals. The dishes she served looked and smelled wonderful, but there was something off about some of them. A sweetness that didn't belong, or a texture that wasn't quite right. When guests complimented her cooking, she would watch them eating with this intense look, not pleased exactly, more hungry. It seems that Ruth's culinary abilities were exceptional. A scarce letter from a guest who returned home unharmed, written in August 1894, states, "The meals alone are worth the price of lodging." Miss Ruth's roast was unlike any I have tasted, tender beyond imagining, with a flavor both familiar and exotic. When I inquired about her technique, she smiled and said only that proper preparation is everything, and that patience yields rewards in the kitchen as in life. I have dined in the finest establishments in New York and Philadelphia, yet find myself craving the dishes served at the Blackwood table. After just 3 months of work, Jenkins departed the Blackwood house. I told Miss Margaret I was needed at home to care for my ailing mother, she said. The truth was, the place made my skin crawl, especially the basement. I was forbidden to go down there, but once I needed to fetch preserves and Miss Ruth was out. The shelves were full of jars, but they didn't contain what you'd expect. I didn't look closely, didn't want to, but what I glimpsed didn't look like any fruit or vegetable I'd ever seen. I left the next day and never went back. The pattern of disappearances intensified as 1896 drew near. 4 individuals who stayed at the Blackwood house between January and September of that year disappeared. Local retailers started to see odd buying trends that were different from what they had seen in prior years. In July 1896, Ruth Blackwood placed a special order with Harper's Ferry apothecary, which was especially significant. The partial receipt, which was retrieved from the apothecary's files, contains a list of substances that, while having valid medical applications, could have strong sedative effects when combined and in specific amounts. No doctor's prescription was located, and Dr. Lambert's records make no reference to treating Ruth for any nervous disorder. The apothecary's comment on the receipt states, "For treatment of Miss Ruth's continued nervous condition, as prescribed." Samuel Cooper, the apprentice apothecary, subsequently told, Miss Ruth had very specific requirements, wanted to know exactly how much of each compound would produce deep relaxation without causing permanent harm. Asked about chemicals that would preserve freshness in meat during summer months. Had an unusual interest in various salts and their effects on human tissue. Always paid in cash. Always insisted on discretion. Cooper provided information that he had previously withheld. Once, when preparing her order, I asked about the purpose of a particular compound, potassium bromide, as it was unusual to request it in such quantities. She looked at me with the coldest eyes I've ever seen and said, "To ensure restful sleep, of course. Some require more assistance than others to achieve the proper state of repose." The way she said it made my skin crawl. After that, I never questioned her orders again. Despite the economic depression that affected much of the region in the mid-1890s, the sisters' business continued to thrive. Regular deposits, frequently in cash, are shown in bank records to be far higher than their reported occupancy rates would imply. During this time, they made a number of important purchases, such as upgraded plumbing fixtures, new kitchen equipment, and a specially made ice box from a Philadelphia manufacturer that was constructed to maintain temperatures suitable for extended preservation of perishable materials, according to the shipping manifest. If a certain visitor hadn't arrived on September 18, 1896, the sisters' actions would have gone undetected as summer turned to fall. A guy who identified himself as Dr. Ephraim Samuels, a dental surgeon who was moving to Martinsburg, Maryland, to open a practice, arrived on the evening train from Baltimore. The registration states that Dr. Samuels paid for a full week's accommodation in advance, which would have amounted to a sizable quantity of money. He was given the Blue Room on the 2nd floor, which had a view of the backyard garden. The fact that this individual was not Dr. Samuels was unknown to the sisters. The real Dr. Ephraim Samuels had passed away in Baltimore 3 months prior, according to county records. James Pinkerton, a private investigator employed by the family of Howard Phillips, the businessman who vanished in February 1893, showed up to Blackwood House that September evening. After months of research, Pinkerton discovered a pattern of disappearances linked to the boarding house and traveled to Harper's Ferry. He remained undercover as Dr. Samuels for 3 days, eating meals with the sisters and following their schedule. The youngest serves each dish personally, always waiting until guests take the first bite before retreating to the kitchen. The meals are exceptional, perhaps too much so. There is an unusual aftertaste to the evening wine that I've been careful to only pretend to consume. Pinkerton wrote in his personal journal, which was later found among his belongings in Baltimore, that the eldest speaks little during meals but observes constantly. Second night dinner consisted of a roast that Miss Ruth described as locally sourced game. The texture was unusual, not like any venison or rabbit I've encountered. The sisters watched with particular intensity as the other guest, a Mr. Carrington from Richmond, consumed 2 large portions with evident enjoyment. I claimed a headache and ate sparingly. Mr. Carrington became noticeably drowsy during dessert and was helped to his room by Miss Eleanor. When I inquired after him at breakfast, I was told he had checked out before dawn to catch the early train. His last diary entry, dated September 21st, 1896, "Am now certain of my suspicions. Have observed basement windows from garden. Unusual equipment visible. Metal table with drainage system. Large preservation containers along walls. Hooks in ceiling with pulley system. Will implement plan tonight. If I do not report to Baltimore office by noon tomorrow, Agent Thompson should proceed with contingency arrangements." Pinkerton carried out his scheme to find out what happened to visitors who never left on the evening of September 21st. He pretended to be more drunk than normal after supper, slurring his words and struggling up the stairs to his room. The sole record of what transpired next is Pinkerton's report, which was submitted to the Baltimore police and then sealed until it was discovered in 1962. The sisters assisted him in going to bed, with Margaret telling him that a good night's sleep will set everything right. He said Pinkerton waited until around midnight, at which point he heard footsteps coming down the corridor. He opened his door and saw Margaret and Eleanor coming in with what he described as a large canvas sheet, several lengths of rope, and a collection of knives and other implements of a concerning nature. Pinkerton, who had not eaten the drugged food or wine but had disposed of it in a discreet manner, faced the women. The ensuing altercation was not documented in detail since his report was sealed before the pertinent pages were taken out. The only information available is that Pinkerton quickly departed Harper's Ferry the next morning and went back to Baltimore, where he filed his report before completely vanishing from the annals of history. One passage from Pinkerton's report survives, and it offers a tantalizing hint as to what might have happened during that meeting. When questioned directly about the fate of Mr. Phillips and the others, the elder Miss B exhibited no shame or denial. She stated with perfect composure that waste is a sin, and that men of means who travel alone are seldom immediately missed. When I suggested that authorities would be interested in her philosophy, she indicated that her family's connections would prevent any serious inquiry, as had been the case previously. The look in her eyes convinced me that removing myself from the premises immediately was the wisest course of action. Even more disturbing is a notation found in a margin of the report, apparently added later by Pinkerton. Miss R. appeared in doorway during confrontation. Carried large cleaver. Smiled in manner most unsettling. Suggested I might contribute to the household in ways other than financial. Elder sister ordered her to return to kitchen. Believe my survival due solely to precaution of informing Baltimore office of my whereabouts and suspicions before arrival. A curious entry from September 23, 1896, in the Pinkerton Detective Agency's internal records, which were made partially available to researchers in 1967, states, Agent Pinkerton returned from Harper's Ferry assignment. Submitted written report and verbal briefing. Exhibited unusual agitation. Requested immediate reassignment to Western Territories. Request granted. File sealed by order of senior management. The Jefferson County Advocate published a brief notice 3 days after Pinkerton left, stating, "The Blackwood sisters have closed their boarding establishment indefinitely due to family matters requiring their attention elsewhere." The house was sold to a family from Washington, D.C., after being vacant for several months, who reported finding the premises in immaculate condition, as though thoroughly cleaned before departure. Edward Collins, the real estate agent who handled the sale, later recalled, "The house was spotless, unnaturally so for a building that had been vacant for months. No dust, no cobwebs. The basement had been completely whitewashed floor to ceiling and smelled strongly of lye. The kitchen had all new equipment, perfectly clean pots and pans that looked as though they'd never been used. Most strange was the garden. It had been dug up entirely, and the soil replaced with fresh earth. When I asked about this, the neighbor said the sisters had engaged in a flurry of activity just before leaving, working day and night in the garden. Said they'd mentioned something about enriching the soil before departure. Collins added a detail that he had not shared publicly before his interview with Professor Whitaker. The new owners discovered something unusual during renovation several months after moving in. When removing wallpaper in the dining room, they found what appeared to be a ledger or accounting book concealed within the wall. They contacted me, knowing I had handled the sisters' affairs. The book contained entries that made little sense, lists of names with dates and amounts, but also weights and what appeared to be evaluations of quality. Terms like prime, select, and standard appeared next to some names. I advised them to destroy the book, which they did. Some things are better left unexamined, particularly in a house where one must continue to live. Even the sisters themselves appeared to disappear. There is no entry in the local transportation logs for their departure. The post office did not have a forwarding address on file. The only evidence of their existence is that in October 1896, a porter at the Baltimore train station told police that he had helped 3 ladies of mature years traveling with an unusual amount of luggage, including several large trunks that required 2 men to move, board a train to Philadelphia. Their sizable account at the Harper's Ferry Bank was closed, and the money was transferred to an organization in Philadelphia under the name Shepherd Sisters Investment Trust. He remembered them in particular because the youngest had a peculiar intensity to her gaze that made me uncomfortable, and the middle one insisted on handling certain small cases herself, saying they contained fragile items. The porter's account, taken as part of the Phillips family's private investigation, includes a disturbing detail. One of the trunks was damaged during loading, and the corner broke open slightly. I noticed a peculiar odor and offered to repair it, but the eldest lady declined most firmly. She positioned herself to block my view of the contents, but I glimpsed what appeared to be glass jars or containers inside, carefully packed in straw. The youngest sister whispered something to her that I couldn't hear, and they both looked at me in such a way that I felt it best to complete my duties and remove myself from their presence as quickly as possible. The Blackwood House narrative was largely forgotten for almost half a century, and it was only mentioned sporadically when talking about companies that had once been based in the town. At the time of the sisters' departure, Harper's Ferry was experiencing economic deterioration, and locals' attention was diverted to more urgent issues. The house itself was owned by multiple people. Between 1897 and 1923, it was sold 3 times, according to county records, each time after the owners had been there for less than 5 years. The grounds for these sales show an odd trend. Each family stated that they wanted to return to relatives in more populated areas or look for possibilities abroad. None expressed any particular displeasure with the property, but none remained long enough to become well established in the neighborhood. Henry Goodwin, who bought the property in 1912 and sold it once more in 1916, subsequently told his grandson, "Nothing wrong with the house itself. Solid construction, beautiful views, but it never felt right. My wife complained of bad dreams, said she could hear sounds in the walls at night, like something moving or scratching. The children refused to play in the basement, said it smelled wrong and made them feel sick. I'm not a superstitious man, but even I had to admit there was something off about the place. We never discussed it openly, just decided one day it was time to move on." Questions regarding the Blackwood House didn't come up again until 1953, when Professor James Whitaker started studying business ventures in Jefferson County after the Civil War. Almost by chance, Whitaker, a careful historian who was especially interested in the ways the war had affected local economies, came across the sisters' story. Among the papers he found in the basement of the Jefferson County Courthouse were several odd purchase orders from a Baltimore chemical supply company. The directives, which were issued between 1892 and 1896, specified drugs that were known to have sedative effects when taken in tiny amounts but had no apparent domestic purpose. Chloral hydrate, a sedative that was widely accessible at the time but infrequently bought in large amounts by private individuals, was included in the chemical orders. Various preservation compounds, leather tanning chemicals, and substances that, when added in small amounts, may successfully hide the natural taste of food were also listed. Whitaker expanded his investigation because he was curious. He discovered the journal that the local doctor, Dr. Morris Fletcher, kept while the boarding house was in operation. In an entry dated October 1896, shortly after the sisters' departure, Fletcher wrote, "Have examined the basement room at the request of the new owners. Found evidence of extensive cleaning, though traces remain. The drain in the floor shows signs of frequent use. The hooks in the ceiling are not consistent with normal food preparation. I have advised the new owners to seal the room entirely. Some matters are best left undisturbed." A subsequent entry in Fletcher's journal adds, "Mr. Collins has consulted me regarding certain stains found beneath the recently removed floorboards in the basement. I have advised him that the discoloration is likely due to mineral deposits from the proximity to the river." This explanation appeared to satisfy him, though I am not convinced of its accuracy. Some questions are better left unasked in a small community such as ours. Most revealing is an entry dated December 1896, apparently written after Fletcher had consumed what he described as perhaps more brandy than is advisable for a man of my years. The more I reflect upon what I observed in the Blackwood basement, the more disturbed I become. The configuration of equipment suggests a purpose I dare not name. The drainage system, the hooks, the table with its channels and collection basin, all suggest activities that civilized minds refuse to contemplate. And yet, I cannot dismiss the correlation between guests who were never seen to depart and the exceptional meals for which the establishment was known. God forgive me for even entertaining such thoughts. Whitaker contacted descendants of Harper's Ferry residents from that era as a result of this discovery. He started creating a timeline of disappearances using these interviews, connecting them to specific entries in the Blackwood House guest register. Every absent individual was noted to have paid their bill and left, always within 3 days of arriving, and always after dining with the sisters. When Whitaker was able to track down Martha Simmons, whose grandmother had been a laundress at the Blackwood House, his investigation took an unexpected turn. In an interview conducted in 1961, Simmons recalled conversations with her grandmother. She wouldn't talk about it much, but sometimes after a few glasses of blackberry wine, she'd say things that didn't make sense to me as a child. About how she wasn't allowed in the basement after certain guests had checked out. About stains on linens that Miss Eleanor insisted on washing herself. About smelling something like a butcher shop coming from the kitchen when she arrived early one morning, though Miss Ruth claimed to be preparing a special breakfast. Most disturbing was Simmons' recollection of something her grandmother had witnessed in the summer of 1896. Grandmother said she came to work earlier than usual one day and saw Miss Ruth in the garden behind the house. Said she was burying something wrapped in cloth. When grandmother approached, Miss Ruth straightened up quick and said she was just planting new herbs for the kitchen. But grandmother said there was a smell, and the cloth was stained dark. Miss Ruth gave her an extra $1 that week and told her not to come so early again. Simmons also shared a story her grandmother had told only once, on her deathbed in 1932. Grandmother said that once when cleaning the dining room after a special dinner party, she found what looked like a small bone under the table, not like chicken or beef, more like a finger joint. She said when she showed it to Miss Eleanor thinking it might be important, Miss Eleanor took it quickly and said it was just part of the special roast. Then Miss Ruth came in from the kitchen and whispered something to Miss Eleanor. They both looked at Grandmother in a way that frightened her badly. She said, Miss Ruth told her, some secrets are best kept by those who wish to keep breathing. Grandmother never spoke of it again until she was dying and felt she needed to unburden her soul. According to Whitaker's research, there may have been a connection to 3 women who opened a small restaurant in Allentown, Pennsylvania, in 1897 under the name Shepherd Sisters. The restaurant was open for about 2 years before closing abruptly after a patron took ill suddenly after dining alone at the establishment, according to local newspaper accounts. The owners of the Shepherd table are listed as Mary, Elizabeth, and Carolyn Shepherd in the 1897 Allentown City Directory. A review of the Shepherd table in the Allentown Morning Call in December 1897 offers an uncanny echo of descriptions of the Blackwood house. The establishment offers cuisine of remarkable quality, particularly the roasted meats, which achieve a tenderness and flavor that larger restaurants cannot match. Whitaker wrote in his research journal that although the image is not clear enough for positive identification, the resemblance is striking, particularly in the case of the youngest, who has the same distinctive gaze described by multiple Harper's Ferry residents when speaking of Ruth Blackwood. A photograph in a local business association publication features 3 women whose approximate ages match what the Blackwood sisters would have been at the time. The 3 sisters who operate the establishment maintain an atmosphere of refined dignity, though some might find the youngest sister's intense observation of diners somewhat disconcerting. Gentlemen dining alone are treated with particular attention and are often invited to sample special dishes not listed on the regular menu. In March 1899, a death occurred that led to the restaurant's closure. A businessman called George Harrington was discovered dead in his hotel room the morning after eating at the Shepherd table, according to police papers that Whitaker was able to get. Authorities sought to question the Shepherd sisters about Harrington's last meal, but they had already closed their restaurant and left Allentown. The coroner's report listed the cause as acute gastric distress of unknown origin, but a note in the medical examiner's personal papers suggested possible poisoning cannot be ruled out, though no known toxin presents this particular pattern of symptoms. There was no forwarding address given, just a brief notice in the newspaper saying they had relocated to pursue opportunities elsewhere. Whitaker's path from Allentown led to comparable establishments in several places: a restaurant in Chicago, 1906 to 1908, a modest hotel in Cleveland, Ohio, 1903 to 1905, and a boarding house in Rochester, New York, 1900 to 1902. The pattern was the same in each place: 3 women running a restaurant with a reputation for great food, followed by the mysterious absence of male customers, followed by an abrupt closing and move. For Whitaker, the Chicago connection was especially beneficial to his studies. A restaurant called the Sisters' Table was listed in city directories as being open from 1906 to 1908 on the near north side. 3 ladies who called themselves the Shepherd Sisters, Mary, Elizabeth, and Caroline, owned the business. If they had taken on new names, their ages would have roughly corresponded to those of the Blackwood sisters. It's exceptional cuisine, particularly the house specialties of roasts and stews, which the youngest sister reportedly prepares according to old family recipes. The tenderness of the meat is remarkable, achieving a quality that few professional establishments can match. Whitaker's 1962 interview with a former waiter at the sisters' table was more telling. The Chicago Tribune reviewed the restaurant in December 1906. The man, then in his 70s, recalled, "The place was unusual, not like other restaurants where I'd worked." The sisters kept to themselves. The kitchen was strictly off-limits to staff, except for the one busboy they allowed to help with heavy lifting. They had a special room in the back that was always locked. Once a week, usually late Tuesday nights, deliveries would arrive. Large ice boxes that the youngest sister would inspect carefully before they were taken to that back room. The waiter continued. There was a private dining room where special guests ate by invitation only. Always men dining alone, usually well-dressed businessmen or travelers. The sisters would serve them personally, no waitstaff allowed. Sometimes those gentlemen would look a bit unsteady when leaving, like they'd had too much to drink, though I never saw excessive alcohol being served. The youngest sister, Caroline, they called her, would often help them into cabs, saying they needed assistance returning to their hotels. Strange thing was, a couple of times, guests who left like that came back the next day looking confused, saying they had no memory of leaving the night before. An investigation into the disappearance of William Carver, a Kansas City cattle buyer who was last seen going to the sisters' table for dinner on April 17, 1908, was reported in Chicago police records from that year. When the restaurant closed and the owners fled the city without being questioned, the investigation was concluded. A notation in the file indicates that unusual modifications to the basement area were discovered during inspection of the vacated premises. The investigating officer, Detective Michael Sullivan, added a personal note to the file. Basement contained custom drainage system and evidence of regular hosing down. Large hooks mounted in ceiling beams. Floor recently covered with new concrete, but core samples taken from several areas show possible blood residue in deeper layers. Neighboring businesses reported unusual garbage disposal practices. Sisters never used regular collection services but removed trash themselves during late-night hours. Sullivan's final comment in the file reads, "Similar pattern to Rochester and Cleveland cases. Same 3 women, same type of establishment, same customer demographic targeted." Evidence suggests organized, methodical operation rather than crimes of opportunity. Recommend coordination with authorities in previous locations, though suspect subjects have already relocated beyond our jurisdiction. It gets harder to follow the track after Chicago. According to Whitaker's notes, there may have been ties to businesses in Buffalo, 1912 to 1914, Detroit, 1909 to 1911, and Pittsburgh, 1915 to 1917. The pattern was the same in all cases. 3 women, great food, disappearances, and sudden move. Because the Pittsburgh connection signifies the trail's conclusion, it is very intriguing. From 1915 to 1917, a little eatery called the Family Table was open in the Oakland area. According to city records, it was owned by 3 women, Jane, Anne, and Martha, who claimed to be the Wilson sisters, but whose physical attributes and business license applications closely resembled those of the women who had run the sisters' table in Chicago. The youngest of the sisters, Martha Wilson, was referred to as the culinary genius whose recipes had made the family table a required destination for those seeking exceptional dining experiences. The Pittsburgh Press reported in June 1917 that she had died suddenly from complications from influenza, although the Spanish flu pandemic had not yet reached Pittsburgh. The memoirs of Dr. Errol Jenkins, a Pittsburgh doctor who cared for Martha Wilson during her last illness, provide a more illuminating narrative. In a memoir that was privately released, Jenkins wrote, "The case of Miss Wilson remains one of the most disturbing of my career. Her symptoms did not align with any recognized disease process. Progressive paralysis, cognitive deterioration, and eventually respiratory failure. Her sisters refused to allow her removal to hospital, insisting on home treatment only. Most curious was their reluctance to allow me to examine her food or medication. The elder sister suggested that Miss Wilson's condition might be the result of occupational exposure to certain chemical compounds used in their culinary business. I suspect a case of accidental self-poisoning, possibly from substances used in food preservation, though the sisters would not elaborate on their methods. After Martha's passing, the eatery shut down for good. The last two sisters vanished completely from the public record. Whitaker's notes speculate that Martha Wilson was actually Ruth Blackwood, and that her death marked the end of the sisters' activities. A brief item in the Pittsburgh real estate notices stated that all business assets had been liquidated and the proceeds donated to the Red Cross war effort, as the sisters had returned to their family home in New England. Ruth would have been around 54 years old in 1917 if the pattern is correct. This is a pretty young age, but it is compatible with the stressful life and potential exposure to hazardous chemicals employed in their operations. If Margaret and Eleanor were the other Wilson sisters, we don't know what happened to them. According to Whitaker's study, they might have moved to a tiny hamlet in Vermont or New Hampshire and lived out their days in anonymity while basking in wealth amassed over many years. Whitaker vanished in March 1968 while looking through documents in the Chicago Historical Society's basement archives. His study materials were discovered neatly stacked on a table, along with a partially written note that said, "I believe I am being." After a brief inquiry, Chicago police determined that Whitaker had most likely experienced a medical issue while working alone and had wandered out in a condition of confusion. Since his body was never located, the case was not considered a suspected homicide, but rather a missing person case. Despite the fact that Whitaker's briefcase, coat, and hat were still at his desk, and that the day of his disappearance was marked by temperatures much below freezing, this judgment was made. When a Historical Society staffer discovered an odd object in 1969 while organizing the storage room where Whitaker had been working, it became an interesting footnote to Whitaker's disappearance. A tiny, leather-bound notebook that was not part of the collection was nestled between two old ledgers. There was a list of names and dates from 1893 to 1917, along with notes about flavor, tenderness, and quality. 3 days after it was turned in, the notebook vanished from the Chicago Police Department's evidence vault. According to reports, the clerk who discovered it retired early and soon afterward relocated to Arizona. Within days of Whitaker's abduction, federal agents confiscated his research. Access is prohibited until 2023, and the most of it is still classified. The scant information that has been made public offers intriguing but insufficient tidbits about a case that may include several jurisdictions and span decades. There are more questions than answers for the few researchers who were given restricted access to Whitaker's files. According to a carefully worded 1965 paper by one such researcher, Dr. Elizabeth Chambers of Columbia University, the Blackwood case represented a pattern of behavior that may have been repeated in multiple locations across the eastern United States between 1870 and 1915, always involving female proprietress of boarding establishments, always targeting male travelers of means, and always characterized by an unusual attention to the culinary experience offered to victims. Chambers' paper does not make specific accusations, but it strongly suggests that the Blackwood sisters, and possibly others using similar tactics, were at fault for a number of disappearances over the course of decades. Her implication that the sisters might have had apprentices or collaborators who carried on their crimes long after the original offenders would have grown old is the most unsettling. When a writer looking into a string of disappearances in Minneapolis discovered the records of a tiny restaurant that had been there from 1920 to 1922, This notion unexpectedly acquired traction in 1966. Aunt Martha's Kitchen, as it was called, was operated by two older women and a third, much younger lady who identified herself as their niece. The journalist died before finishing his inquiry after suffering a crippling stroke while doing research. Therefore, his work was never published. There is still conjecture on what actually transpired at the Blackwood house. The tangible proof has long since vanished. Had the sisters lived to adulthood, they would have passed away prior to 1950. There can be no legal reckoning today. The bits, however, still exist. Ledgers revealing odd purchases, a visitor register with names that correspond to missing persons, reports submitted in far-off locations, a doctor's mysterious diary entry, and the incomplete research of a professor who disappeared while trying to make connections between these seemingly unrelated pieces. The cookbook found in 1972 while the Blackwood house was being renovated is arguably the most unsettling. The handwritten volume, which was discovered sealed inside a wall hollow, had recipes written in Ruth Blackwood's unique script. Several pages had been taken out, but the majority were traditional cuisine of the time. Federal authorities confiscated the cookbook, which included the following statement on the inner cover: "The secret is in the preparation. Patience yields tenderness. What seems unpalatable can be rendered delicious with proper technique." Although its present location is unknown, there are persistent reports that it is part of a unique collection at the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, where profilers study it in an effort to better understand the psychology of killers who operate over long periods of time and across various jurisdictions. Ruth Blackwood's cooking philosophy is disturbingly revealed in a single recipe that survived from the cookbook because it was copied by the contractor who found it before the authorities came. Titled simply Special Roast, it has standard instructions for cooking but notes. Subject must be properly prepared. Soak for minimum of 6 hours in solution described on missing page. The quality of the final result depends entirely on the care taken during preparation and the choice of proper subjects. Those with excessive physical activity produce tough, stringy results. Those with sedentary habits and rich diets yield the most tender portions. There have been sporadic attempts to restart the Blackwood case inquiry in the years following Whitaker's disappearance. Administrative challenges or the convenient loss of important documents have been encountered by each. The most recent attempt was started in 1966 by a true crime writer, but it was abandoned when the writer had a crippling stroke before finishing his investigation. The Blackwood sisters are currently only mentioned in passing by Harper's Ferry local historians, typically in reference to companies that were active in the late 19th century. The boarding home used to be known for its excellent meals, but tour guides seldom mention the disappearances or the investigations that followed. The structure itself has undergone numerous renovations. Dr. Fletcher's journal mentions a subterranean room that was sealed up during 1923 renovations and is still inaccessible. In an interview with the Jefferson County Historical Society, a former tenant mentioned that the house feels strange at night. Not haunted exactly, more like it's remembering something it doesn't want to share. However, the current owners say that no strange things have happened. We focus on John Brown's raid, the Civil War, the natural beauty of the area. Visitors come for history and scenery, not to hear about the darker chapters. The Blackwood case is something local historians know about, but it's not something we emphasize. Some stories are better left untold, acknowledged Park Ranger David Morris, who leads historical tours of Harper's Ferry, in a 2002 interview before acknowledging that certain aspects of the town's history are deliberately omitted from official narratives. There are still people in town whose grandparents or great-grandparents knew the Blackwood sisters. It's not something they like to discuss. There's a sense that whatever happened in that house should stay buried in the past. Richard and Susan Thornton, The present proprietors of the former Blackwood house bought it in 1998 without knowing anything about its past. In a 2005 interview, Susan Thornton stated, "We found out about the sisters after we'd been living here for about a year. A neighbor mentioned it casually, as though we should already know. We did some research at the Historical Society, but there wasn't much information available." Richard Thornton continued, "We've never experienced anything unusual in the house. Well, except for the garden. Nothing grows in certain spots, no matter what we plant or how we treat the soil. And there's a corner of the basement that always feels colder than the rest of the house, even in summer. But that's probably just poor insulation in an old building." In 2009, while renovating an ancient Pittsburgh restaurant building, a sealed wall hollow containing multiple glass preserving jars was discovered. This discovery created an intriguing postscript to the Blackwood story. After over a century, the contents were severely degraded, unrecognizable, and disposed away as biological waste. One jar, nevertheless, held a little metal item, a pocket watch with the initials HP inscribed on the face of the case. According to records, in 1917, the Wilson sisters owned a restaurant called the Family Table in the building. The watch is still in the collection of the Pittsburgh Historical Society, which claimed it. Officially, there is no link to Howard Phillips, the first known victim of the Blackwood sisters. How the curator of the Historical Society put it, "Certain artifacts raise more questions than they answer, and perhaps that is as it should be." One note discovered among Professor Whitaker's belongings following his disappearance may provide the best epitaph for the Blackwood case. The most terrifying aspect of evil is not its monstrosity, but its mundanity, how easily it disguises itself as service, as comfort, as a well-set table with a hot meal waiting. The words were written on the back of a train ticket to Chicago. Today, tourists pass the former Blackwood house in Harper's Ferry without a second look. The mountains silently bear witness to long-buried secrets, and the rivers continue their endless confluence. And maybe Ruth Blackwood's recipe book is in an archive somewhere, with missing pages that contain directions that should never be followed again. One intriguing anecdote for those who study such topics is that, from 1897 to 1915, local newspapers in cities throughout the eastern United States occasionally featured articles about establishments, restaurants, boarding houses, small hotels, where the proprietors were renowned for their superb cuisine and attentive service. These businesses often ran for fewer than 3 years before abruptly closing. The pattern of disappearances persisted in each place. Wandering men who were last observed chowing down on a substantial dinner before completely disappearing from the canon of history. It's possible that the hunger that pushed the sisters to serve more than supper found new kitchens, new tables, and new patrons for many years after they vanished from Harper's Ferry in 1896. Perhaps that table is being set even now someplace in America, as the last entry in Ruth Blackwood's kitchen ledger stated, "When the pantry is empty, it is time to set a new table."